Good. All right, here we
He,
go. So
he
everybody
might
can
be able to compete with the fat electrician.
yeah. So here's you guys can all see my slides, right?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. So this was John Kaminsky had suggested wonder weapons in 1946, and he had if the war had kept on, what could we have seen? What would have gone on? And he had pointed to a particular website called Luft 46. I've seen a couple other websites that, particularly, there was an aeronautical one that talked about a lot of the stuff that might have been, or experimental planes, and we'll get a little bit into that. And I'm going to start with the Germans, and then I'll just kind of um, dally and a couple of the other, um, you know, participants in the war. And of course, I tried to definitely stay away from some of those wonder weapons that we saw in our fake AI history a couple of months back, you know, of this stuff. So the German approach to wonder weapons was basically the Germans lacked central planning and development authority, so things were all higgledy-piggledy, with people throwing ideas out there. And Hitler was easily swayed by any idea that was just going to be, cool and new and update and give them an advantage. And so I threw these two pictures down. One is on the left, we got a V1 launching site as they look like they're getting ready to light this thing as they're all running from it. That was one of his wonder weapons that he actually introduced in mid 44. Um, and
Hey,
then you
Bruce.
got Hitler was grandiose in his visions of things that should happen. And I don't know if you know, but he had planned this whole tearing down and rebuilding of Berlin in this, monolithic, imperial style. And he spent a lot of time studying Albert Speer's designs for Berlin. He just, where were his priorities? And then I thought, of course, I thought this particular picture of a gigantic triumphal arch was kind of amusing, given the current conditions we live in. Um,
It's sort of reminiscent of Spinal Tap, though, isn't it?
yeah, right.
Good one.
But Allied attacks really reduced availability of key materials, and it really limited what the Germans could do and so you see a lot of their plans like, oh, we thought about building this, yeah, we're running out of time and materials. So let's just dive in. We're going to talk about some of the German stuff. We'll start with their airplanes, which was really on that Luftwaffe 46 website, focused on that. So one of the first things the Germans did build and was successful was a jet-powered bomber, this Arado 234 Blitz. And they actually used it, and it was operational in August of 44. And they built 244. And this is an example of, had the war gone better for them and lasted into 46, would we have seen more of these things? It made the first jet-powered reconnaissance over England. They used it in the Battle of the Bulge, and they used it also to attack the Remagen Bridge in March of 45 when the First Army had accidentally captured the Remagen Bridge, a thing that we covered in one of our history talks a long time ago. Um, and they were trying to blow the bridge up, right? So there's only one survivor, and it's at the Udvar-Hazy Center, which is the Smithsonian extension that's at Dulles Airport in outside of DC. There's my first typo for John, who likes to, point out my typos. The Germans went on to come up with a crazy idea to build a small jet fighter that would be launched by an Arado to attack the American bomber formations. And so it was the Parasite, and they wanted to build the Arado E-381, which would have been the small jet-powered Parasite that would launch from an Arado and then attack the bombers with um, uh, 20 millimeter cannons, 30 millimeter cannons, 45 rounds, attack the bomber formations, and then the guy would then drift back down to earth and land on skids. And that was how it wasn't a suicide weapon, but this is the kind of thing that The Arado 234, the bomber, actually was built and used. The Parasite was a design that never got manufactured or used. The Germans were really in a panic emergency fighter program trying to counter the Allied bombing campaigns, and they were looking at a lot of jet-powered stuff. And here's a couple that were designed and never built. The Arado 580, this little thing here with a single engine behind the pilot. The Arado 581, a flying wing. Flying wings were a hot thing and we'll see more of those. It was a scaled down version of the Arado Flying Wing 555 bomber, but they never built it. You know, they were going to build this Flying Wing bomber. They were going to build the Flying Wing fighter. This Arado Project 2 fighter never got into production due to the end of the war. They were getting close, but it never got into production. They actually had, I think, one experimental type and sort of a modern looking fighter for 1946. But had they not had the problems, had the war gone better for them, they not had the restrictions on materials, and then had they more time, would we have seen some of these fighters, you know? The Germans did have, during the war, this America bomber program. Basically, they wanted to be able to build a bomber that could reach America so they could reach out. And particularly, they always, you know, the goal was to be able to reach New York City and back, from bases in France, say, or Norway. And so a lot of this discussion in 42 and 43, could we build bombers that would have the range? And a lot of these plans would be dropped due to lack of expense and lack of key materials. But a lot of these things would be dropped in, 43 or 44 when, yeah, it's not going to work. So the one design up here in the upper left is the Arado 555, a jet-powered bomber. None were built. The Junkers 390 in the bottom left, they actually built two of them and flew two of them. And there's actually some, apocryphal stories that one of these bombers on a test flight got within 60 miles of New York City by flying across the Atlantic. And other people are like, yeah, maybe not. It's, conspiracy theorist types things. Oh, it happened, it didn't happen. There's another story about the Ju-90 that one flew nonstop from Berlin to Tokyo over Russian territory. And so there's these claims, they're made in the late 50s, early 60s. There's not a lot of supporting documentation for those claims, but they did actually, in fact, build two of these prototype planes. The Me-264, Messerschmitt 264, another long-range bomber, 3 built. So they were thinking about building these big bombers. The Germans really didn't have a heavy bomber throughout the war, but lack of materials and stuff causes them to scrub this stuff. So a lot of this stuff was gone by 44.
How come they didn't use U-boats? I mean, they're parked right off the shore. I mean,
Well,
even the deck gun, like firing an 88 into the Statue
well,
of Liberty.
we'll get to that. And Bob, it's great to
Okay.
hear you. It's been a while, so thanks for
Yeah, I
joining.
know. I'm here.
Another design that they got was the Horton HO 229. This flying wing bomber, light bomber, and they've actually built 3 of them. I don't know if they got them to flying status, but there is a survivor that you can see pieces of at the Smithsonian Udzey Center in Dulles. They had a rocket program. All right, Bob. So here we go.
Okay.
The A4, which is the 4th one from the left, it became the V2. And they developed that. We all know they were firing V2s and they were happily firing V2s. And there was an idea, Project Schwimmwest, where they wanted to build a container that would go on a U-boat that would contain a V2. You would tow this raft all the way across the Atlantic to outside New York, open up the towable raft, and there'd be a V2 and launch it. So here was an idea of fire at New York City with a V2. That project got canceled, shut down. It was unworkable. Why didn't they use deck guns to fire on? We know that the Japanese in 41 fired on a oil plant outside of LA.
Okay.
We do know that they used their deck guns. So, for instance, if you go to this Aruba, where there was a oil refinery um, in 42, I think a U-boat surfaced and fired at the refinery. It is an interesting question of why didn't the U-boats just use their deck gun? I guess they'd have to get too close. They were worried about the air power by the time they start thinking of this nonsense. Why not? The A-10, which is the one shown in the left, was a design by our good buddy Werner von Braun, was going to be a first two-stage rocket. And the A-10 itself was the first stage. The A-9, the second one from the right, would have been the second stage. I got it backwards. And the A-10 was designed to be recoverable from sea, which since they didn't control the sea, that would have been interesting. And the A9 was going to be designed to be able to hit America. So you use the A10 to launch. The A9 launches off the A10 and goes all the way to America. And then they had even a later design, which was A12, to be able to put stuff in orbit. And so Werner von Braun is building these rockets for the Germans, and he's designing this stuff like, oh yeah, we'll build something to attack America. The A-12 didn't look like it was being designed to attack anybody. It looked like it was designed to put a rocket into space. And I'm like, Werner, where were your priorities in 1945? You know?
Bruce,
Yeah.
to answer the question, why didn't the Germans use deck guns on the United States? By the time they got around to even thinking about surfacing and firing on the United States with deck guns, we had too much air power patrolling the coast, and it was too dangerous for them to surface. They were basically up until then they were focused on sinking
The tank.
cargo shipping to starve out England.
Yeah.
Before we leave the rocket page, tying back into our review of war movies, there was a movie in the mid-60s, Operation Crossbow, which the premise of it was a German rocket that was being designed and built to hit the U.S. and George Peppard was in it, and the efforts of the Allies to foil the project.
Well, I'll have to go and watch that one. I don't know that.
Yeah, I've seen it.
I don't recall seeing it.
Yeah, I've seen it. I don't recall if it's good or not.
Well, I'll let you know. So, bigger tanks. They were interested in bigger tanks. And I thought this quote from Hans Guderian, the famous German panzer general, Hitler's fantasies sometimes shift into the gigantic. So, a tank that they had, we know they built the Tiger, the King Tiger, the Tiger II, which was a monstrous tank with an 80, gun. And they actually built and put that into combat. Well, the next one after that would have been the Panzer VIII, the Maus or Mouse, German for mouse, because that's like a joke. Would have had a 128 millimeter gun. They actually kind of got around to building three of them before the Russians overran the production facility in Eastern Germany. It would have been 120 tons, much, much bigger than a King Tiger. But it was canceled in August of 44 as just being unworkable. 128 millimeter gun would have been one of the largest guns put on a tank in World War II. I think the Russians, which I didn't cover the Russians here, by the way, they had a tank towards the end of the war where they had put a 128 millimeter gun, and that's kind of a standard size modern tank gun would be about 128, big enough to manhandle the shells and stuff. They then had the goofier idea of building a thing called the Rate or Rat. None were built. It would have been 1,000 tons. Can you imagine this thing being 8 times heavier? It would have been, and they were going to use the turret, reuse a battleship turret from the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau, and this thing would have been monstrous. And it would have been so big it would have had anti-aircraft batteries on the back. Here's a model of what this thing looked like that they mocked up.
What bridge could that cross?
None. That was part of the problem with both the mouse and the rat, which is the roads can't handle it, the bridges can't handle it, you can't transport it on rail. How in God's name are you going to get it into battle?
And you're
Looks
not
like a
taking it
G.I. Joe
across
toy.
mud either.
Yeah. And on this model, they've actually put a model of a Panzerkampfwagen 4 on the back of it to give you a scale size. This would have been just insane. It was basically called a land cruiser. It basically would have been a battleship on land, and just and Hitler loved this idea. He's like, yeah, let's build it. And like a couple months later, Albert Speer, who's both his architect and becomes the minister of production, he later quietly goes, "No, we're not doing that, and don't anybody ever talk about it again." It's like Albert Speer's like, that's just a silly idea. We're not going there. I thought it was interesting in looking into the German tank ideas that they had actually even in their German military magazine Signal that got, they produced, and the Allies would actually get copies of this, snuck out of occupied Europe and try to glean it for intelligence. They had an article in Signal where they talked about the Panzer IX and the Panzer X, and they had this drawing of the Panzer X. And and they're saying, oh yeah, we're working on these brand new tanks. And these were fake ideas, just designed to be printed only in Signal to throw the Allied intelligence off about what the Germans were doing and capable of doing. I just thought it was interesting. So on top of their wackadoodle ideas, they also had fake ideas just to throw people off. They wanted to build bigger ships. Now, the biggest battleship the Germans built was a 15-inch, eight guns, 15 inches each, on the Bismarck and the Tirpitz. And they were going to build an even bigger ship, and it was going to have 16-inch guns and be bigger. And that was part of their plans. Before the war, the Germans had a plan, Plan Z. And Plan Z was their plan where they were going to build up the Navy to be able to be a competitive Navy against the world powers that give them strength. And they're going to build aircraft carriers and battleships and cruisers and destroyers. And it was all predicated on not going to war before 1943. Well, somebody didn't tell Hitler that. And so when it came about, some of their plans were scrapped. But H-39 design was actually part of Plan Z. That they had, we were going to build 4 of these ships with 16-inch guns, and they actually laid 2 down. They were never completed. They were scrapped in 1941 to reuse the metal for other priority things. But since some of the guns had been built for this, they actually then turned around and put those guns on the Atlantic Wall. And so here's a picture of one of the 16-inch guns that were intended for the H-39 being used as a battery on the French coast. Then, as was pointed out in a previous talk, that the Germans, a lot of these German designs were, how much of these designs were real and how much of them were to keep the designers from being sent to the Russian front to fight. We get into the H-41, and the 39, 41, 42 are the years that the design was promulgated. So the H-41 one says, let's go to 16.5-inch guns. And the H-42 is like, let's go to 18.9 guns. And the H-44 is like, I got it. How about 20-inch guns? In 1944, they're talking about building a battleship that's going to take 3 years to build. Larger designs, only conjectural. Hitler pressed for them. He kept asking for better and better designs. And they didn't even tell the leaders of the Navy that they were doing these designs. These guys were just sitting in a room just drawing fanciful stuff that made Hitler smile, but had no reality. In fact, the later designs, particularly the last one, Germany couldn't even have built in one piece. They didn't have a big enough slipway to build that ship. So, just absolutely farcical, fanciful designs. U-boats, they wanted bigger and better U-boats, and they did make a lot of progress in this area. And so one of their main U-boats were the Type 7 and the Type 9. The Type 9 was the larger transatlantic U-boat. That's the one that would appear off the eastern seaboard of the U.S. and wreak havoc. But it was, your classic um, diesel electric uh, submarine. And so along comes the in 43, they started thinking about a boat that is powered not by diesel, but by hydrogen peroxide. And that would leave, and the output of hydrogen peroxide would have been water and oxygen. It could be stealthy, it could be fast, and they were going to build these things streamlined. They laid down two, but they never finished building two of them. The hydrogen peroxide was really dangerous. It had a tendency to leak and kill the crew or explode. So it was really a problematic type boat. But they had built a streamlined hull for the Walters boat to achieve terrific underwater speeds. And so then someone said, well, why don't we take that streamlined hull and some of those ideas and build an diesel electric boat or an all electric boat, the Type 21, that would achieve a terrific underwater speed. So for instance, it was going to achieve 16 knots underwater when their standard Type 7 could only go 7 knots underwater. They actually built 118 of these, and one of them went on operational patrol. And it was right in April of 45. It was out in the North Sea, and apparently it was sneaking up on a British cruiser and was stealthily sneaking up on a British cruiser. That underwater speed is very interesting. 16 knots, in that much of the cheap anti-submarine warships that the British and the Allies had built were designed to be able to outrun an underwater U-boat. And they could do anywhere from 15 to 20 knots. Well, now if the U-boat can do 16 knots, that's going to make, instantaneously make a large portion of the Allied anti-submarine fleet obsolete and not as useful. And that would have been a real problem. So if we had gotten into 46, these new and improved U-boats, which would have been the biggest improvement in about 2 years in U-boats, could have caused trouble in the Battle of the Atlantic if they got around. And then they finally had another design of the Type 24 small Walther boat, which would have been the hydrogen peroxide drive. And they designed it to be tiny so it could sneak along in coastal waters. And basically the western approaches to England, which is where the convoys all had to go to deliver goods to England, and troop ships and all that, had become just an unlivable space for U-boats and had been unlivable for 3 years. Well, maybe if we built this stealthy, fast hydrogen peroxide boat, we could get back into the western approaches. So these U-boat ideas were actually some closer, more realistic ideas the Germans had to tilt the war a little bit more in their favor had the war not ended. A lot of these German U-boats would be captured by both the Russians and the British and the Americans and studied after the war for designs. I don't know that we picked up too much on them. The streamlining of the hull certainly was interesting. The snorkeling was interesting that we wanted to borrow. I thought it was interesting is that with all this high-tech German stuff that they were working on, that there was actually a dedicated scientific team that the Allies put together. Actually, the Americans put one team together, and the British put their own separate team together, and the Russians had their own team. But the American team was known as Operation Lusty, which was to collect and evaluate German tech. So they founded this team at Wright Field in Ohio. It was led by Colonel Harold Watson, and they were known as Watson's Wizards. And they were going to focus on aircraft on this stuff, and they were able to actually, as they're traveling in late 44, early 45, they're traveling around occupied the freed parts of Europe, and they're right behind the armies, and they're grabbing any German tech that they can come across. And as they get into March and April of 45, they start capturing German pilots and some of their planes, and they actually convinced some of the German pilots to join their operation as test pilots in exchange for getting out of the PO, just being held as regular POWs. And they joined the team post-war. Could you show us how you fly an Arado 234? Can you show us how you fly an ME 262? They gathered up a whole bunch of stuff, and you can see this tug pulling a barge with a bunch of German airplanes on it. And then they sent it all to the French coast, where they hijacked an escort aircraft carrier and loaded it up with stuff. And I was actually stunned to find this picture on the lower right of the deck of the aircraft carrier loaded with Arado bombers and ME 262s and sent to the States. The British had their own collection of this stuff. They had their own team doing this. And that's why, to this day, the Smithsonian has some German high-tech jets from the end of the war because of, this Operation Lusty. I thought I would touch on the Japanese efforts. And the Japanese efforts, not as advanced, I would say, partly because they were really late suffering, but also sort of half of the Japanese efforts were sort of fatalistic panic. So on the left, we have a picture of this standard Japanese suicide boat that they were building, and they were going to use in massive quantities should the invasion of Japan have happened. And basically, it was a boat driven by one person that would have been just absolutely filled with explosives. And they had imagined that we're going to have these hidden in caves. They actually did have these hidden in caves in large quantity on the coast of southern Japan. And had the invasion going to happen, these were going to come out in droves and try to ram, particularly the transports. Another fatalistic effort that actually got into operation was the middle picture of the Baka bomb. This was a jet-powered bomb that would be flown by a pilot, and is a special version of the kamikaze. They actually had several of these take effect, but they also were building these by the dozens, and these would have been lifted into the air by a mothership and then lit off, and they were designed to attack shipping as well. And then to show the ultimate fatalization of Wonder Weapons of 46, this lower picture, we have the Japanese officer teaching civilians how to use sharp, pointy sticks. So the Japanese wonder weapon of 1946, had the invasion occurred, would have been sharp, pointy sticks. They were kind of desperate. I did find on one of the pages, some designs for Japanese jet-powered aircraft. I picked two here that got closest to production. The top one is a 2-engine jet-powered light bomber that they got kind of almost close to putting into production and testing So had the war lasted into 46, we might have seen some of these things participating. The Yokosuka Tenga. Then down below the Nakajima Kika is the Japanese copy of the German Me-262. The Germans gave in 44, a Japanese engineer went to Germany and studied the Me-262 plans, and he brought back notes and some plans. And then the Germans were sending in May of 45 U-boat with an engine and parts and materials and more detailed production plans for the Me-262. But before that U-boat could get to Japan, it was captured by the Allies or sunk by the Allies. So the Japanese never get it. The Japanese went ahead and were able to reproduce the Me-262 based on what notes they had taken by that engineer on his trip in 44. And they actually got this jet just about operational. So these two things on the right were sort of the kinds of things that maybe the Japanese could have gotten into the air, but the Japanese were suffering from, the same problem the Germans were doing, which was lack of materials or they're strong, being strangled. I thought it was interesting to look at, what would the Axis people have done had the war lasted longer? What could they bring to the table? What's interesting about the Allies, and I only covered the British and the Americans, I forgot to dig into the Russians, is that the Allies actually were able to deliver stuff. And we're going to look over the next few pages of stuff the Allies actually coughed up in 46, which meant that this stuff was actually going to be there. This wasn't fantasy dreams of Hitler. This was real stuff. So the first thing we have is what the U.S. fleet was planning to do. And one thing is that they were building these 4 Midway class aircraft carriers, and I've got a picture comparing a Midway to the Essex class. The Essex class was 24 ships they were building, 24 aircraft carriers they were building. It was the standard workhorse aircraft carrier for the Americans in World War II. The Midway was going to be bigger. It was going to be 45 tons versus the 27-ton Essex. It was going to have an armored deck. And it was going to be able to carry 130 aircraft versus the air group of an Essex, which was 100. So more planes, bigger ship, real mean thing. The Midways were actually so big that they only recently retired them in the early 2000s. And you can go visit, I think it's the Midway that's out in San Diego, much bigger than the Essexes. So these things were coming on board. They would have added, and they had the armored deck. What was the first U.S. carrier to have an armored deck. The British had been using armored decks for quite some time. I think what's interesting is the 130 aircraft. They're saying that given elevator space and takeoff space and everything, it's actually more aircraft than you could use. You couldn't launch a strike of 100 aircraft. Strikes could only be like 60, 70 aircraft. So you could launch one strike and then you have to bring up the second strike for range. Another innovation the U.S. fleet was going to bring in 46 was to replace the 40 millimeter Bofor. Now the 40 millimeter Bofor is like a 1.5 inch gun. And that had been the standard medium-sized anti-aircraft weapon that our fleets were using against the kamikazes. Their heavy anti-aircraft weapon, of course, was the 5-inch 38. Well, they were designing, when the kamikazes came up, they immediately went back to the books and they said, how are we to stop these guys? We're going to need a bigger, heavier hitting weapon. And that's when they took the old 3-inch anti-aircraft gun that we had and learned to make it auto loading, as fast a firing and it would have been, the shell would have been twice as big as the shell on the Bofor's 40 millimeter. And that really would have had the punch, particularly with the proximity fuses to make hash out of kamikazes. So we were going to get those sometime in 46. The new carrier aircraft came along and actually got operational by August 45. There was actually a squadron that had equipped with them in 45, but not gotten into combat, and it would have been the Grumman Bearcat. And this would have been an updated, more powerful, faster, more heavily armed version of the Grumman Navy airplanes that had started with the Wildcat and then the Hellcat. This was going to be the Bearcats would stay in production, and in combat right up through the Korean War. So this modern fighter really could have would have made its impact on the war. And we have a picture of a Bearcat actually flying over the Midway carrier down below. And then because things were, we're just adding all sorts of ships to the Navy, new destroyers, new cruisers. But we were going to get a new class of heavy cruiser, 8-inch cruisers, that had auto loading guns. And if you come up here to Boston, you can visit the USS Salem. That's one of these ships that's left over. They were going to build like 10 of them. They scrapped all but 2 of them, or canceled them. But what an auto-loading gun would have just been a horrendous rate of fire with the biggest shell. We did have auto-loading 6-inch cruisers during the war, the Cleveland class. And the Japanese, when they had to fight those cruisers, referred to them as the machine gun cruisers because they would fire shells so fast it was like a machine gun. So now imagine having a much bigger shell doing the same thing. So the Japanese were in for a world of hurt if the war had kept going into 46. U.S. Air Power, what were they going to do? We introduced our first viable jet. It wasn't our first jet, but it was the first one to go into production and would have been a fighter, which is the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star. They actually were starting to equip squadrons with it at the end of August of 45. So this would have been definitely in production, both for the Navy and the Air Force, by 46. And this Lockheed Shooting Star would see action in the early part of the Korean War. So this is definitely a jet fighter that the Americans would have used during 46. In 46, the Americans would have brought even bigger bombers. So we had the B-29. Well, they had envisioned up engineering, making a better, more reliable engine for the B-29, and it would be able to go farther, carry more, and that was the B-50. And this thing got into production towards the end of 45 and would have started to make its appearance in 46. And then I thought that was interesting that the Convair B-36, which was known as the Peacemaker, that didn't come into, it was in production, it was in prototype in 45. And sort of the first one flew in 46, but it didn't get into operational status to 48. But had the war gone on, would they have worked harder to get the Convair B-36 into production? And this is a picture of a Convair B-36, which is a combination jet and propeller driven. Well, it actually started out as all propeller driven, but then they converted it with partial jet, partial propellers. And it would become a strategic bomber for us before the B-52. So you went from the B-29 to the B-36 to the B-52. And here's a picture of it sitting next to a B-29. You can just see the massive size of this plane. But had the war gone into 46, they might have accelerated the plans for this, and we would have had this jet, this new plane. This plane was designed, its original genesis was way back in 42 when they said, can we build a plane that can hit Germany having been taken off from the United States? They needed a plane with that much range, and the B-36 could have done that. So just an incredible plane. It could have been possibly brought into production in 46 had we gotten.
Bruce,
Yeah.
at that point in the war, why were they worried about having to base them in the United States?
No, at that point in the war, by the time they actually got it operational, they were just going to have it.
Okay,
Then you can take it anywhere you want,
like Russia.
like Russia. The British were making their aviation updates too, and so we have the Avro Lincoln, which would have been the follow-on to the Lancaster. It would have been longer range, higher ceiling, and designed to carry heavier bombs and bigger bombs. So they were building these. They were building bombs too big for even the Avro Lancaster. Now the Lancaster was the best British plane to put into production during the war. And it did all their heavy bombing, but they were going to build a bigger and heavier thing. And this thing could have been in production by 46. And they were designing blockbuster bombs to go in, into this plane. So this would have been seen on the thing. The British had their first jet fighter in the Gloucester Meteor. And it actually saw action right at the end of the war. It actually got into combat right at the end of the war. They had built 4,000 of them. And one of the first things it did when it got operational is they were using it to knock down the V-1 flying bombs. And as the V-1 flying bombs were coming over, they could go and hunt these V-1 bombs down. They could actually catch the bomb and either shoot it down or tip it over so it was out of control. Um, the
So they would actually bump the bomb?
They would fly up to it, fly it, and then the pilot was trained to tilt his wing up a little bit so that it tilted the wing of the V-1 bomber. It would tap the V-1 bomber wing. The V-1 bomb would lose altitude and control and then crash, hopefully just over farmland. And that was a technique for taking down V-1 bombers. Partly because you didn't have to get too close to the thing. If you got too close to the thing and you were shooting at it and it exploded, you could have problems, right? So they finally, at first, they wouldn't let the Meteor off England. Don't fly over occupied German territory. Don't. We don't want the Germans capturing our jet. They eventually did allow a couple squadrons to go to Europe, and they were based out of the Netherlands, but they were not allowed to fly east of Eindhoven in the Netherlands, or over occupied territory. And then they started to worry about the Russians capturing one. We don't want the Russians capturing one. So they did do some air combat over German planes that came over Allied territory, but they were forbidden from flying over occupied territory. They also built the de Havilland DH Vampire. This was their second jet fighter, twin engine fighter. And this Vampire would actually get, both for the Royal Navy, it would be navalized, so you could launch it from carriers. And it was also for the Air Force. And this Vampire is so good that it actually lasted into the early 60s. The Meteor didn't last that long. It would have been replaced. But the Vampire, being a better jet, lasted a bit longer. But we would have seen both of these British jets in action by 46.
Bruce, back on the jets for a second. Is there any record of jet dogfights? I know the German jets were used to, intercept bombers and stuff, but was there a situation where it was a jet versus jet combat?
I'm going to give an answer where I think I'm 60% right. I think the answer is no. So you would need an ME-262 fighting something. Now, I know they had P-51 pilots try to tangle with ME-262s by making, passing runs at them. But I'm not aware. Phil, are you aware? I don't.
Not jet versus jet. The only successes I heard were 51s against the 262,
Yeah.
and the first successful shoot downs of 262s were by Tuskegee Airmen.
Yeah,
I'm
I
gonna say
understand.
I'm gonna say the answer is no, because I think that if you read the history of the Korean War, they talk about the first jet versus jet dogfights.
Okay. Yeah, I know sometimes they would follow back the 262s, follow them for a while and get them as they were trying to approach for a landing.
Yeah. I would say that had the war gone into 46, you would have seen one of the three fighter jets that we've talked about, two British or the one American, that would have tangled with 262s.
I heard it. I heard a Tuskegee Airman talk about how he managed to get a 262, and it was because he was able to turn tighter and shoot at long range in front of the 62, and it flew through his bullets, and it got it that way.
Yeah. So these were real things that the Allies were doing. The British Navy wasn't standing still, although they had been. The British Navy had all sorts of wild designs. They were going to design a class of battleships known as the Lion class, and they laid them down in 39, and they never got built because in 41 they're like, scrap them. We need to be building destroyers, you know. Um, and they did concentrate on aircraft carriers and destroyers, anti-submarine vehicles, so their battleships were laid up. But in fact, the British did eventually get around to building the last battleship ever built, which was the HMS Vanguard. A picture of it here. And what they did is they used spare 15-inch turrets, because one of the longest lead time things for a battleship is the guns and the turrets. Um, and they had these spare turrets lying around since the 40s. I mean, since the 20s. So they said, well, let's just build a battleship around that with everything else being modern, anti-aircraft guns and all that stuff. And so here's a picture of the Vanguard itself. They were going to they built the Audacious class carriers. They were going to also build another class called the Malta. They canceled the Maltas because they were running out of time and money and space. But the Audacious, they actually finished two of the planned four. But these would have been bigger carriers for them to use, the armored deck. It would have been the next big British carrier. They were building bigger destroyers. The battle class destroyers were twin turreted destroyers that were going to be big, mean, and nasty. Now, the British during the war had built lots of destroyers, but they were all smaller. They call them the emergency war program destroyers. They were all more or less a repeat of the same class over and over and over again, but a smaller destroyer, because they just needed them built as fast as possible. But bigger destroyers took time to build. But by the end of the war, the British were feeling more optimistic, and they were going to build these battle class destroyers, which had better AA armament, more firepower, and so there would have been a more and a bigger British Navy towards the end of the war as well. Um, as I said, I think the real challenge would have been the kamikazes in the Pacific with the Japanese and the kamikaze boats, and the real challenge in 46 would have been new and improved German submarine designs. So, so that's it. That's what I've learned about 46. Had we gone on, kind of what would it have looked like? You know, how could this thing have dragged on? Um, I think knowing what we know, it's more likely that the Japanese could have dragged into 46 than the Germans did. If we drag into 46 and we've got the bomb, if the European war drags into 46 and they got the bomb, basically they were going to use the bomb on Germany. If Germany was still doing its thing, you know, Berlin might have been the first target of the atomic bomb. if they were still kicking around in August of 45. So who knows what the thing would have been like. So that's what
Bruce,
I got.
did you see anything else on the giant Japanese submarines that had the aircraft launching capability?
Oh, you're talking about the I-400 class.
I don't know.
Yeah. So they built during the war, they built the I-400 class that could carry 3 airplanes. It's the largest submarine built until the nuclear submarines are built. And we actually captured a few of these at the end of the war. And they were designed, their design with 3 aircraft was to build several of these, send them all together, and then they were going to be a squadron that could simultaneously attack the locks of the Panama Canal. That was their design. Let me see if I think I've got a picture. If you want to read about the I-400, I don't know that the Japanese were working on any. They were just constantly cranking out more or less the same
Volume.
submarine.
Yeah.
Towards the end of the war, they started to build submarines just for transporting supplies because they had so many cut off garrisons that their efforts were there.
Yeah,
Japanese ships, yeah,
my understanding is that those large submarines, the ones they adapted for the aircraft, were actually freighter type submarines.
yeah.
And
So
although I don't think none of the big submarines are left. I think the U.S. sunk one when the Russians asked to see it. But there is one of the aircraft again at the Udvar Huzi
yeah.
in Dulles.
Well, and they just recently rediscovered by mapping the sea bottom the sunk remnants of one of the I-400s off
Ah.
Hawaii where we sank it. So anyway, so that's our chat for today. Looking for other topics. Bob, it's great to see you. Join us here.
Yeah, good to listen again.
Yeah. And
Hey, Bob.
Hey, what's going on, boss? Oh,
let
there
me
I am.
stop recording.